He'd get as many students as he could and bring them all in, and then they all sat around the corner waiting, and he'd bring them up one by one and they'd recite. And he had the old ferrule right at hand, that sort of thick leather strap, and if the kid missed his declensions or something, whammy on the knuckles and so on and so forth. And that was great motivation for them to be prepared when they came up to the schoolmaster. But there was nothing at all like what we would today consider a school. But there was money involved in this apparently, and this was for people who could pay, but for kids who would not be going to the university eventually. So maybe the bourgeoisie who wanted their kids to be able to read and possibly write, or they wanted to go into some other careers where the university curriculum had no meaning, well, they'd go to these little schools. But like the writing masters, this was carefully controlled by the diocese. And each schoolmaster had his assigned territory. Now this is one of the things that got the founder in trouble, because when he started opening up his school, as rival to them, he was invading on a territory that had been assigned to a particular schoolmaster all the time. We have to recognize that the founder was operating outside the law a good part of the time, if you want, in terms of what the law required. Okay, so now these schools the schoolmasters were obliged to accept poor students without a fee. But needless to say, they didn't work very hard at recruiting them. And again, the poor kids didn't want to come because they didn't mix well in that company and so on. And so the teachers always treated them as second-class citizens and so on. So very few of the poor ever took advantage of that. Now, what about poor kids? Where did they go? Well, every parish was supposed to be operating what was called a charity school. Now, the charity schools, every parish had one, and these were open only to the certified poor. The pastor was supposed to keep, now we'll see all of this in detail in the life of the founder, especially when you read Milan. But each parish priest was supposed to have a list of the poor that the pastor would certify as poor enough and impoverished enough to be able to come to these schools. But these schools, there were no standards whatsoever. To be a teacher in one of these schools, there were no particular requirements. Most of the teachers that a pastor would hire would be dropouts from the university or sometimes dropouts from the seminary. Their attendance was spotty, truancy was rampant, no discipline at all, no systematic instruction. And at the slightest excuse, the pastor would close the school for long periods of time. The budget would run out, or there'd be a fight in the parish council, which they did have in those days, by the way. And for any slightest reason, or they only had one teacher and he got sick or something like that. So it was no way, actually. It was just an awful, kind of a messy situation. And sometimes when a schoolmaster got tired and wanted a little extra money from the parish, he might take over one of the charity schools too, with all of the things and so on. So that's pretty much the school situation. Yves Boutet makes an interesting comment in his writing of the history of the Institute, the foundations of the Institute, that De La Salle never opened a school. Now, I'm not sure that that's completely accurate, but what he did in almost every instance was take over one of these parish schools and transform it into what he called a Christian school. Right. So that's kind of the school type of situation. So you see how segregated this is, and how it conforms to the stratified society at the time, and how desperately indeed it was of reform, especially if the poor were ever to get anything that could even roughly be called an education. Now, so that of course always raises the question of who are the poor. So some of that stuff that I gave you to read from Yves Boutet, I think makes that kind of clear. The poor were not the absolutely destitute. The poor were people who would have work sometimes and not other times. The artisans were those who had a craft of some kind, a marketable skill, but there wasn't always a market for it. And then the poor would be janitors, manual laborers, people who had to earn their living by the work of their hands. The fundamental definition of the poor, I think, for the founder would be those whose lives were had no real dependable, steady income, long periods of poverty, and having to send the children off to work very early in their life. Maybe a husband and wife both working. Very few could afford to marry before the age of 30, that type of thing. The absolute destitute, the worst cases and so on, were not exactly the group that the poor addressed. Now, there was another institution here that we should mention, in addition to the parish schools, that more or less corresponds to that, and that would be the General Hospital, as it was called, the hôpital. It's difficult to translate because it's not a hospital in the modern sense. I use the word hospice sometimes, but that has other meanings in English too. But these would be the poorhouse, and every major city had one. And of course, Adrien Niel comes out of the hospice in Rouen. The building still exists, and the founder finally wound up there with some of the brothers, as we'll see. Now, in this poorhouse, the poorhouse took care of all of the problem people in the society. That's where the half-crazy wound up, the destitute, the homeless. Sometimes parents who had to work all the time would put their kids there, and vagrants. It was a very, very mixed sort of a thing. And so this movement to try to get some kind of an education for the poor, there would usually be some kind of an educational program associated with the general hospice. So that's another type of institution that was there, and Boutet makes reference to that. So, and in addition to all those people, you'd have the incurably sick who would be part of the thing too. And when the brothers go to Rouen, we'll see what a bad deal they got there, precisely because they were because they had to serve all of these various types of needs. Right? So, one of the reasons why the founder, so what about the Christian schools? See, what was a Christian school? Because it doesn't fit into any of these categories. I think that's one of the things that the founder had to find some way of describing the type of school that he wanted his brothers to be involved with. And so, of course, Christian, as I said, it already means Catholic, and it's clear that the founder wanted the school to be an instrument of religious instruction, but that was characteristic of almost every one of these schools in a Catholic, in a very Catholic type of society. This is what I had the argument with Bonaventure Minor over. So he felt that if we call it a Christian school, that meant that this was a school where religious instruction was paramount. Well, there's truth to that, but I think that the other thing is that he wanted to have a term that was different from charity schools. Some others before the founder had used the term Christian and charity schools, but I think the founder just decided to call them Christian schools because he wanted to indicate that this was something distinctive. And it was done the school was run in a distinctive way by a distinctive community. So when people heard about like Frères de l'École Chrétienne, that would mean something very distinctive to them. And so the distinction, of course, would be those things. Of course, religious instruction, but then the other thing would be excellence in quality as distinct from the charity schools. And then thirdly, of course, the principal thing was gratuity, and gratuity for all, no matter who came. And that's exactly what gets the founder into an awful lot of trouble. Jean Pongier has put together a few little, he was putting together some notes one time when I was over there. Jean Pongier is one of those who's been working a lot on the conduct of schools and the whole business of schools. And he had some photocopies of some lithographs now, these sheets that I have are based on that, but maybe you can examine these yourselves a little more, and then there's a description of them on the second page in French, and you can read the French. But let's just take a look at some of these lithographs from the period, so you can kind of see. Would it help to put the lights out a little bit? I don't know. But that's one of the preceptors. In a home with two wealthy kids. Barely can't see very much there. But now this would be a typical school desk. And if you look closely, you can see the rule, or no, it's the preceptor. That's why, one of the preceptors. Yeah. Here's the ferrule here. He's got it ready to hand, ready to wallop them with. Now the schoolmaster would have one in one of his hands too, but it doesn't show up so well. So there's the one kid reciting, huh? And he's got his back to all the others who are doing whatever they feel like over there. The family cat's here in the corner, or is it a dog, or a tail. But that's one of the petites écoles. And that man would have had a monopoly for that particular area where he was running a school. Now this is one of the public scribes, one of the dropouts from the guild See, here he is over here writing letters to people, and sets up his booth, and so somebody who wanted a letter written would go to him. Jean Pongier quotes here a typical request for a letter, and this is in poetry in French. And it all rhymes in French. Monsieur, je suis très malheureux, j'aime une jeune demoiselle, et je ne suis point connu d'elle, elle se nomme Louison. Monsieur, I'm very unhappy, I love a young woman, but I'm not she doesn't know me, and her name is Louison. And I know very well her house, and it's necessary that you take up your pen to write me a letter full of beautiful discourse, or that you do it in verse, or that you explain to her the day when I first got to know her, and that there is not at all anywhere in France a man more in love than myself, and I want that you will express to her my faith, and afterwards you will say to her still that in my soul I adore her, and that her beautiful eyes make me die. You have the knowledge to write this well, and if you will do the rest, go ahead. And finally, I want to protest to her that I wish to live now and forever as her humble servant. And it's necessary then, and then at the bottom of this, it's necessary to put, or at the top of it rather, to Mademoiselle Louison, living with the Alazan family, just on the 6th floor, near the Cabaret de la Cage. I don't know what's the Cage de Faux, and in a room 2 doors removed, near to the Church of St. Peter. And so it's very cute French thing. Those of you who read French get the poem. So that's the professional scribe. And that's how they made a living. And this is see it says down here, the Chambre du Syndic. This is the room of the syndicate, of the writing masters. And all of their samples of writing on the wall, all of their royal privileges. Notice the royal seal and the seal of their guild. And it says on the bottom there, la verification de la fausse et bonne écriture. And that's their motto, to verify the difference between good and bad handwriting. And so that's the Guild of the Writing Masters. So those pictures may help fix some of that in your mind. Now while I have this projector here, and this is a kind of a transition between yesterday and today, I guess, in a way. Here are some samples of Jean-Baptiste de La Salle's handwriting. Now, I just clipped these out of the 900 samples or so that we have that Léon Arose has in his thing. The one on the top, he was 15 years old, and he's signing the birth certificate for the birth of his brother Pierre. And notice how heavy and intense it is. Now these samples, more extensive samples from letters, I guess, of his handwriting were submitted at various times by various people to be analyzed by handwriting experts. And Léon Arose told me when the results of this first came out, Nisei Joseph was the superior general, and he swore that this would, he said to Arose, "It's a good thing you weren't around when the founder was being canonized, or he never would have been." And the superior wanted to suppress it because, now Gus will go into this in greater detail, that he shies away from remarks like this, which I'm not at all afraid to bring to the fore. And so here's one line, and and it's all indicated with the characteristics of the handwriting that are the clues to this. It says, he shows resentment, moreover, that borders on touchiness, the angles of the letter A. He does not find it easy to accept criticism from others, even when such criticism is justified. There are times when he has a strong tendency to succumb to sensuality. The open A and the open O. You better take a look at your own handwriting. Especially when he is quite nervous. He is austere, but in trying times tends to become irate or to become sexually soft with an impulse to self-satisfaction. That may be a comfort to some of you, or us. But I used to be a little suspicious of this, but Malcolm O'Sullivan in our community, whom some of you may know, is really had training in this and is an expert. And I have a friend of mine who has a kind of a very funny way of writing. And I just, for kicks, I asked Malcolm sometime, would you do this for me? And I was surprised how long it took him, and I didn't realize what I was imposing on him. So he wrote me up a page or so about, and he didn't know who the person was at all, male or female. It was a male friend, and he had the person down to absolute perfection, including things like he's unhappy because of the death of his father. He said it's evidently a male. He regrets the recent death of his father, and all sorts of other details about this that Malcolm had no way of knowing. But he got it all out of the handwriting. And that kind of convinced me that there must be something to this skill, that our unconscious comes through in our handwriting, and people who know it, like people who know how to interpret your dreams and so on. Well, anyway, so, and of course the point that in that one article from that one analyst makes the point that in a way it makes the founder's life much more interesting when you realize he wasn't naturally austere and wasn't naturally self-controlled and so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to intrude on Gus's territory, but he'll go into more of this in his characteristics, but these are some things to look for. But notice how the handwriting develops. Now, the second one is from 1672. It's a signature on a contract, all right? And this would be, while he's gotten rid of all of that heavy type of writing, and it's you can notice that it's very precise and very definite, and this would have been the year that his father died, when he was beginning to take over the affairs of the family. And he's 20 years old at this point, or 21. Now these last two come from 1718, the year before he died. This one only about 6 months. So you see already now what's happening to a lot of us when you get to that ripe old age. The handwriting begins to fall apart a little bit and so on and so forth. And it's rolling all over the place. Arose has another interesting thing about the loop on the D in the De La Salle. Now, one of the big arguments among Lasallian scholars, maybe that we may as well get out of the way now, is what are we going to call this man? Now, the French have all finally settled on La Salle. And in, I think, the most recent issue of Lasalliana, there's an article by an Italian brother who berates the English-speaking brothers for always want to call him De La Salle. But I like De La Salle for many reasons, and one of the reasons being that's the way he always signed himself. And Arose told me that he prefers De La Salle too, but he finally felt he had to succumb to the others, and he refers to him as writing all the time as La Salle. And he says he really prefers the De La Salle. And one of the interesting things about this is, remember, his father's name was Louis, and his father always had a way of writing Louis De La Salle with the loop, and the loop running into the D. And De La Salle picked up that loop from the Louis when he signs his own name at the beginning of the D. Arose has studied that in some detail of examples where the way of doing that loop into the D are exactly the same. And so that's another interesting aspect of his personality, his relationship with his father, and Gus will talk a little bit about that too. And of course the other thing with now sometimes he writes it as all in one word, as a lot of them do, and sometimes he leaves it off, but the fact that he signed himself that way makes sense to me. Now you have a lot of examples like La Fontaine is De La Fontaine, and the D gets lost from that one. But a couple of his teachers, like Desperier and De La Stock, they sign themselves always with the DE in front of it. The argument of the French is that, well, that was a pretension to royal extraction, and since he was only bourgeois, really, he had no claim to royal title, and the DE was a little pretentious, etc., etc., etc. And there's a whole big long thing about it in Poutet, and of course the Italian is again speaking all the time from this connection with royalty, which really is not a it's not a concern for us, let's say, in the United States. We don't get all that hung up on all of these class distinctions. Yes?
Who would have thought that was on the right?
Probably the preceptor, but all of the people who went to the university had to be able to write it. The problem with the writing masters was they were afraid that people would begin to sell their ability for handwriting. It was taken for granted, I suppose, that a university student would have to know how to write.
Where would trade schools fit into this?
They didn't have any that I know of.
Like, for example, it talks about St. LaSalle went to a school and they were making stockings.
See, the trades were, remember, this is before the Industrial Revolution, so all of those skills were taught by the people who had the skills, and most of them were in the hands of guilds. So if it was any serious mastery of a skill, like carpenters and things like that, I presume they would have to be trained as apprentices by some master carpenter. Right? Now, in that school where they were making stockings in the parish of Saint Sulpice, I just presume there was a craftsman who knew how to do this, and he had whatever civil machinery that they had to use, and that way they were able to get money for the kids. I'm not aware that there was any such thing as a trade school in anything like the modern sense. Gus?
Well, I remember at St. John, there was a whole vocational program, watchmakers, landscape art, and the so-called delinquents that were placed at St. John had a whole gamut of vocational programs. So it was probably a case of skilled participating.
Or getting some master to come in and teach them something that they might be able to use afterwards. Yeah. But vocational schools as such as an institution.
It seems from that manuscript handout to you that writing was a big component of the brothers' school.
Oh, definitely, sure.
What, he just disregarded the writing
Of
master?
course,
Is that the
of
idea?
course, of course. That's what gets him into trouble, precisely. But because he's also accepting kids who can pay, that gets him in trouble with the schoolmasters, okay? He's in trouble with the writing masters because they're teaching writing, and he's in trouble with the schoolmasters because he's letting in kids, and he's taking away some of their best customers. And you can't blame them. Blatt is deadly on these terrible schoolmasters. You know, De La Salle's the hero, and they're the villains, and they're being moved by Satan and all that sort of stuff. The poor guys were trying to preserve their living, for crying out loud. He was putting them out of business. You know, this. Gus?
The word Christian school, that's a very significant thing. Just like the word institute. Those are two terms that we take for granted, and I really would like you to kind of develop a little more. Why don't Sal call them Christian schools?
Well, didn't I just do that?
You did. I just like you to.
We had that already.
I want you to extend
I plan to do that a little more extensively in the next hour.
I'll come back.
What was the economic background of the schoolmasters, and why would anybody go into that profession?
I suppose they must have had some kind of, at least the beginning of the university education, and either dropped out or couldn't make a living at it, or they found that they could make a living running a school like that. I don't know. I imagine there might have been a fair amount of money involved in it. Huh? And so if somebody went all the way through the university and didn't go on to the formal university doctoral courses, of which there are only 4, huh? So you either went into arts and letters and became a litterateur, which wouldn't attract everybody, or you went into theology, or law, or medicine. So somebody who had started off in the university or had gotten that far enough, but how far in the university they would have had to go to run one of these schools is very problematic. Huh? Some of them, I suspect an awful lot of them might have been dropouts from seminary too, where they would have gotten enough of an education to be able to run a school. Don't forget that it was primarily the mastery of Latin. That was at the heart of the whole thing, and all he had to do was to teach the kids to read, and to read Latin.
Not understanding.
Not understand it necessarily. Well, in our schools, they didn't have to understand it. In these, maybe they eventually got to French. This is all Buttimer too, by the way, so we're intruding on it in a way, and it's not my particular field of expertise, but it won't prevent me from trying to answer a question. Peter?
But you have a little confused when you were talking about the distinction between the poor and destitute. You're saying that the Lasallian workers look for the destitute go to school also?
No, I don't think so, and I don't think he was interested in that. The destitute, most of them would be wind up in the poorhouse, huh? And the really destitute, we're talking here not so much about the children. I suppose he would accept any children, but these would be totally abandoned families and broken up families and all that sort of thing. I think that the founder mostly was involved with schools that were already established in a parish, huh? So that you'd be talking about the poor of the parish living together more or less as a family. I think that might be a safe way to put it. Right? We're talking about social classes. The destitute would be the really down and outers, most of whom would probably wind up in the poorhouse or the hospice. And their kids would either wind up there with them or just go loose all over the place. But when we talk about the kids running loose all over the streets, I think these were the kids in a particular parish. I think that's the way we have to think about this.
One of your colleagues at Manhattan College raised a question, a hypothetical question. You may not want to deal with it either now or later, or you haven't dealt with it in the past, but if the kids were being properly trained in religion, would De La Salle have open schools for the poor?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but I don't think you can really separate it. Huh? That would presume that there was some system for catechizing them, but the only system they had for catechizing them was was the schools or the Sunday services where they get kids in for Sunday school type of a thing. And that was around. I really think, see that I guess my answer to that would probably be yes, he would have, because he saw the school as an instrument for being able to be with them all day, from morning to night. I mean, Boutet makes that point, doesn't it? You know, that this is a thing, that it couldn't just be a question of and at the same time integrating them into something useful. But I think that he saw the school as an instrument whereby you could have this, and I think it's still the valuable thing, which we all know about the school. You have these kids for a very high quality prime time, and all day, every day, except Thursday. You know, but certainly on Sunday, you had them at Mass all Sunday morning, and then you'd have them for catechism on Sunday afternoon, followed by bring them to church for Vespers.
I told them that in the Conduct of Schools, English translation by Moraga, there are 180 pages on the Conduct of Schools, only 25 on catechism, prayer, and mass.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you look at the Duties of a Christian, that's the biggest book that he has. So, yeah. But I think he saw that. I think he finally saw that whole business of the school run by, together and by association, all that. Chris?
I was in answer to Gus's question, coming back to the point you made about the way the school was thought to be part of the church's mission and Christian meant the full life, the full French life.
Right.
That those people who were excluded from French civil intercourse would be those that the founder was concerned about. The nobles and the more wealthy merchants who had their schools that brought into the French society a way of living, which was a Catholic way of living. The destitute were being taken care of in the hospital, and there were some teachers there present with them, and catechetical work was taking place there. Folks had a bottleneck along. But the ones that were coming up now were this new poor bourgeois group that had no stability, no way of being educated into civil life, and that the founder was concerned about that. So I think we would have established schools for them. It's not just a catechetical program. It needs to be brought into the way of salvation and into the times of religion.
He certainly would not have established schools without the teaching of religion. That's perfectly clear. Without religion having a very important part to play. But more about that in the next hour. I'll leave these little exhibits here. Brother Alfred Calcutt, and for some time now he's been preparing this very, very thorough, scholarly, documented biography of John Baptist Lasalle in English. And it's been appearing in installments in what was started off as the London District Newsletter. And he goes regularly to Reims, and he's been able to dig a lot into some of the social and political history of Reims, more than anything else that I've seen in English, at least. Last time I was in Reims, I was able to pick off some of the books that he's been using here, especially he refers to a couple of them here and there, this Deport book, for instance. So I don't know exactly where this fits, but I think you would find it interesting to read. Notice that he uses instead of the term bourgeois, he uses the British term burgess. Remember the House of Burgesses in Virginia? I never realized that was the House of Bourgeois, merchants, in other words. So bring these pages with you maybe tomorrow also. But it's hard to see exactly where it fits in terms of my presentations. But on the one with the map, this will be, we'll have to talk a little bit about that tomorrow when we begin to talk about the founder and his family. But it gives a good idea of the social status of the family. The one on the social classes in Reims has more to do with what we were talking about earlier this morning, about who are the poor and the destitute and so on, and where they all fit. And the type of people that the founder was dealing with. At the bottom of the second page, for example, you'll see some kind of an idea of who it was that, the last sentence on the second page, these children were the preferred clientele of his brother's schools, and it indicates For the small artisan class and the poor, there will be only street plays and puppet shows, the antics of jesters and the feats of tightrope walkers. Crowds would gather of children, nothing to do, passers by to stop and stare, use crude language and smutty jokes. Well, that's how they learned about the frog. All right, let's turn now to this sheet that we just passed out. Now, one of the things that's emerging from contemporary scholarship is that a lot of the ideology that we used to use, or that we were all brainwashed into, was that John Baptist de La Salle was the great innovator in the field of education, that he was the first to use simultaneous method and the first to start instruction in French rather than Latin, etc., etc., etc. Well, the fact of the matter is he probably innovated next to nothing. On the other hand, he made it work, which nobody else before him had done. So in all the biographies, and Rigaud was pretty good at this, and even Blanc has a long section in the beginning. And when Blanc was translated by Hernandez, Brother Charles Henry, who was at that time the assistant, and it was after he finished as general and was more or less in charge of the whole thing, he said, well, it isn't worth doing all of that whole first section of Blanc. In a way, it's too bad he didn't. Although, from your point of view, it's a good thing he didn't, because that would have been another 100 pages or so you'd have to read. But at any rate, that's a good bit of this material is there and elsewhere. And I have a whole chapter on this in The Work Is Yours. The title of the chapter is The Need is Very Great, because if you remember, that's the way the original rules started off. The need for this institute is very great. Well, in terms of what we saw in the last hour, I think that should already be apparent. But it was apparent to a lot of other people before John Baptist de La Salle, and I think we ought to have some idea, at least, of who these people were. Again, this relates more to Buttimer II than to our work here, but it's absolutely necessary, I think, if you're going to understand Blanc and the whole progress of the life of the founder and what it was he saw and how he got increasingly involved in it. Okay, so the first one is this Pierre Fourier. That N should be an R, and it's already marked, I think, in your copy. And notice it's a double R there, although in the early 1700s, all of the proper names in French were, by law, I guess, revised, and the spelling revised, so that there would be a consistent spelling. Too bad they didn't do that with Irish names in the United States, so that all the Kellys would spell their name the same way, for example, or the Kavanaghs, or the any of those Irish names with so many variant spellings, of which some families become very proud. Well, it was the same thing somewhat in France. So especially a lot of the double consonants were done away with. So very often you'll see him in most modern writings spelled with only one R. You can see he died in 1640. That's 11 years before the founder was born. But he founded this congregation of sisters in the Diocese of Nancy, or Nancy, I suppose you'd say. It's very close to the German border in eastern France. And he began to see that women religious wanted to become religious just to be religious, to procure the glory of God. One of his interesting expressions is this reference to procuring the glory of God, which of course is very much a Lasallian expression. But Fourier's insight was that the glory of God could best be procured through the teaching ministry I have here on the sheet. Now, the word Fourier uses through the teaching employment, emploi. And that's another word that the founder uses a lot, when he talks about what you are doing in your employment. I think that's a word we ought to take a closer look at sometime, and this just occurred to me yesterday morning. But because I had ministry here, and I said, I wonder if Fourier actually used that word, and he doesn't. He uses emploi. That being a teacher, being employed as a teacher, in this context, of course, is a way of procuring the glory of God. And that this can be integrated, therefore, with religious life, and it's not something that's apart from it. That there's a relationship between what you're doing in your teaching and the glory of God by bringing, of course, the Word of God and the Christian challenge to students in the schools. These schools run by the sisters were open to the poor, and he thought that gratuity of instruction was absolutely essential if the poor were going to be attracted to the school. One of his major emphases is, again, as the founder saw, the quality of the schools was so terrible that if this was going to do any good at all, the schools had to be staffed by quality teachers. And so, although this was a sisters' congregation, not all the sisters were teaching. But he, among all of the sisters who entered the congregation, he said, pick the best ones, pick the smartest ones to be put into the schools, and give them a superintendent of schools, an inspector of schools, called the maire intendant. That's a word that comes up a lot. It's a technical term. It's kind of an inspector. It's used in the civil things, too. And of course, it has an E in it if it's a she. And the mare, of course, isn't a horse. It's mother. Like years ago, the nun in the subway who announced in a loud voice to some of the others, "Oh, sister, I heard you became a mother yesterday. Congratulations." So anyway, but he wanted these schools to provide for the poor a quality education, and that they should work together to develop methods that would prove to be effective. So now all of this is before the founders even born. Huh? And again, since the poor are here, that the emphasis ought to be on practical subjects, and that they should not be taught individually the way that it was being done in the schoolmaster schools, but that they should be put together in groups of equal ability and equal progress along the line. So although he doesn't use the word simultaneous method, it's pretty clear that Fourier was a pioneer and perhaps the first to really use this method in elementary schools. Of course, it was pretty universal in the university where everything was lectured. And then the other thing is that it's not enough to simply have the kids memorize all this stuff, that somehow they have to understand it. We have to get through to them and so on. And a lot of that depends on how they relate to the teacher. So he has a tremendous emphasis on the teacher being in relationship with these girls all day long. Now, of course, this was simply a diocesan congregation, as most of these congregations of sisters were, and its influence is very limited and so on. But old Pierre Fourier had quite a reputation in his time. Here's a lithograph of him, which I did not make a thing for to exhibit. Not a terribly attractive looking person. He looks rather gloomy. Gus is good at analyzing portraits. Maybe you can find a happier face there than I see. Now, there was another textbook called The Parish School, L'École Paroissiale. And it was, here's the title page of it. And the author is identified by Monsieur I.D.B. Prêtre, priest. And for the longest while, it was considered that this was an anonymous thing. It was Yves Poutet who finally identified who this character was. And he was the pastor of the parish of St. Nicholas of Chardonnay in Paris, where the founder spent a long period in the last year of his life trying to get away from the brothers again. And we'll see more of that later on. But now, this was produced in 1654 when the founder was 3 years old. So again, this was a tremendous emphasis on the person of the pupils. The importance of getting to know the pupils personally. All these ideas are in here. That the pupils can be taught responsibility by giving them individual responsibilities in the educational operation, something that's very strong in the management and in the practice of the founder and the early brothers. And that catechetical instruction, it's not enough to just be theoretical, that they have to be instructed, but they also have to have the example of role models to show them how to live as Christians. It's interesting in the vocabulary of the founder, the word instruct, instruire in French, the founder always by that means teaching catechism, memorizing the catechism. Then he talks about apprendre, which is to take the catechism and put it more into practice, make it practical. And that's kind of the vocabulary at the time. The word montre, when in De La Salle's language, show, is what De La Salle usually uses that word with regard to explaining how to read, how to write, and how to do sums. This again, this parish school, of which this was the kind of the management of the schools, if you will, insisted on simultaneous method in large classes, and a tremendous emphasis on the importance of good attendance, which is one of the principal characteristics of the discipline in the brother school, as we will see as we go along. But I notice I got the but there. There are two major things about this thing that are very different from what happened with the founder. Now again, this is a limited operation, but it exists, and it pre-exists the founder. It exists in this parish in Paris. But again, the author thinks, and the pastor thought, and they all thought, that it was still important to begin with Latin. That Latin is at the basis of all the modern languages, and therefore they ought to learn that first. And only when they've mastered Latin should they be allowed to touch the French. And secondly, the other thing is that for sanitary reasons, they separated the rich and the poor. So part of the simultaneity would not only be according to ability, but the poor would be put into one class and the rich in another, because the poor were so, their hygiene was very dubious. They were filled with lice and all sorts of things. I hope you read some of that in the Boutet thing. So these are two significant ways in which the founder deviated from what was going on here in the parish of Nicholas of Chardonnay. Roland, by the way, lived in this parish for a while too. And so Roland, who had a great influence on De La Salle, comes out of this same background. Now, another school that had a short life in Paris because it was very Jansenistic were the schools at Port Royal, which was a monastery that was, this is another textbook that was around at the time. We can't go into them all. And this is what Port Royal looked like. I don't have it. See how extensive it was. Now, Port Royal, of course, is one of the gates of Paris, the Royal Gate. And this is Port Royal of the Fields, otherwise right outside the gate. But this major enclosure with typical monastic thing, you can understand the French Revolution. We look at one single monastery, it had all this much property. Huh? But this was heavily penetrated by Jansenists, and Louis XIV finally was able to close it. So this, he closed it in 1660 when the founder was 10 years old. Okay? So, but they were one of the principal propagators of the idea of starting instruction in French rather than Latin. And they were also very insistent on teaching good penmanship. How they got away with it with the writing masters, except perhaps that they were kind of an exclusive school off to one side out of the mainstream of society. But they're supposed to be credited with the invention of metal pens. And they had a great deal of skill in the art of tracing. So, and another thing was that they began to see the importance of learning other languages that were current in Europe, especially Italian and Spanish, the other Romance language, as well as Latin and Greek, after they mastered French. And one of the big features of this educational thing that they wanted was